Today we are going to be doing a German short row heel. Essentially what is happening with a German short row heel is you're working along the back of the sock here, and you're going to work back and forth and do German short rows on either side. So in the first section you're going to start with German short rows on the outside and work inward, knitting between them. Then you're going to knit some rounds, and then on the bottom side you're going to start with German short rows on the inside and work your way out to the outside. Now this will make a lot more sense once we actually start knitting, but essentially you're knitting in, knitting a few rounds, and then knitting out. For the purposes of this demonstration, I just have a swatch that I'm going to do the heel on. Normally you would have it be in the round here, so half your stitches would be the heel and half your stitches would be the front. So to get to this point, you'll knit along the front of the sock, and then the back half, needles 3 and 4, or the second half if you're on circular needles, is going to be the heel. That's similar to other heel methods. The first thing that we want to do is set up our stitch markers. Essentially, we're going to divide it into 3 sections. Your pattern will usually tell you, but if you're not sure, you want as close to 3 sections as possible, and if you have an extra stitch, it'll go in the middle. So we have 18 stitches, so we're going to knit 6, place a marker, knit 6, place a marker, and knit 6. Okay, so the wrong side of the work is now facing us, and we've placed our markers. Essentially, what we're going to be doing is knitting back and forth and doing a German short row every time that we switch directions. So we'll start by doing a German short row and then purling across. What you'll do for a German short row is you'll take this first stitch and you will slip it purlwise. Some patterns will have you slip them knitwise. That's a personal preference. You can do it whichever way you prefer. I do it purlwise. We're going to take the working yarn and we're going to pull it up and over the needle. And we're going to pull it nice and tight. So we're going to tug on it all the way until we have a double stitch here. So this is 1 stitch that now looks like 2 stitches. And then after we've created that double stitch, we are just going to purl all the way until we get to the end of the work. We just got to the end, and at the end of each time you work across the heel, you'll turn your work. So now that you've turned your work, the right side is facing us, and we're going to do the same thing. Every time that we do a German short row, we want the working yarn to be in the front. So I'm going to move my working yarn to the front, and then I'm going to slip that first stitch purlwise like we did before, and I'm going to pull my working yarn up and over to the back of the work. I'm going to pull it nice and tight so that we get that double stitch again. Then I'm going to knit across. When I get to stitch markers, I'm just going to slip them for now. That'll be different for different sections, but it'll tell you when to do that. Now that we've created German short rows on either end, we're not going to knit them as we get to them. We're going to knit up until we reach the double stitch that we created. So now I'm all the way almost to the end here, and I have 1 more stitch to knit, and now I've reached that double stitch where it's 1 stitch but it looks like 2 stitches. Now we're not going to do anything with that. When we reach that double stitch, that's our sign to turn our work and to do the same thing again. With the wrong side facing us, we're going to slip that stitch purlwise with the yarn in the front. We're going to take the working yarn, pull it over, create that double stitch, and then we're going to purl to the other side where the last double stitch was. So same as before, we're not going to knit that double stitch, we're just going to knit up until the double stitch. Now we have the same thing here where we've knit up until that double stitch. So we're going to turn our work. With the yarn in the front, we're going to slip that stitch purlwise, pull the working yarn over, pull it nice and tight to create a double stitch, and then we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to knit on the knit side, purl on the purl side, and we're going to keep going back and forth until we reach that double stitch. Every time we knit across, we are getting 1 stitch closer to the center. So we're going back and forth, but every time we're going back and forth, we're going a little shorter since we're going between the double stitches that we're creating. So essentially we are working towards the center stitch markers. We're going to keep going back and forth, make those double stitches until we get to the stitch marker. Once you create a double stitch at the stitch marker, then we'll stop. So I will do that and show you what that looks like. Okay, we are about to reach the stitch markers. You can see we've got all these double stitches here. So we just knit across and now we're turning to the wrong side of the work. So there's just one stitch here before the stitch marker. So we're going to do the German short row like we normally would. There we go, we've created that double stitch. And now we're going to just slip that marker and then we will purl to the next double stitch. You can see that there is double stitches here and there's one regular stitch left. So we're going to go ahead and purl that stitch like we normally would and then turn our work. So now we would do a double stitch here and we would knit across, but we've already made double stitches on this side of the stitch marker. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a German short row with this first stitch, but then we are going to stop here. That is the end of the first part of the heel. Now the next part of the heel, we're going to work 2 rounds all the way around the sock. On the first round, we're going to be knitting these double stitches together, basically a knit 2 together as we reach them. So the first round, you'll do knit 2 togethers, and then when you do the second round, you'll just be knitting them like normal. There's 2 ways to do the knit 2 togethers, and they both look a little bit different. So let me show you what the difference looks like. So you can either knit 2 together through the front loop like you normally would, or you can knit 2 together through the back loop. This is what it looks like when you knit 2 together normally through the front loop, a regular knit 2 together. They both look a little bit different, but they're equally as functional, so it's really a matter of preference of what you prefer. This sock is knit through the back loop. You can see on this one that the stitches here are a little more defined. So this one here is through the front loop, this is through the back loop. It's up to you which look you prefer. So we're gonna go to knit those 2 rounds where the first round we're knitting those stitches together. So we wanna make sure with that first double stitch that we make sure the yarn is in the back so we have a double stitch there. And then we're just going to knit until we get to that first double stitch. And when you get to that double stitch, like I said, it's your choice if you want to knit through the front loop or through the back loop. I personally will be knitting them through the front loop. When you're picking up those stitches to knit them together, you want to make sure that you grab both parts of the loop. There's 2 strands to the double stitch. If you just pick up the front one, just pick up the back one, it'll drop the stitch and you'll end up having a gap. So you want to make sure that you grab both legs of the double stitch. So we're going to knit that together, do the same thing. We're going to make sure that we go through both legs, knit 2 together, and we're going to keep doing that. If this were a regular sock, not just a swatch, the rest of the sock would be right here. So when we're knitting around, we're going to knit around the front of the sock, then across the back. Another important thing to note is that the beginning of the round has moved for this section. Right now, the beginning of the round is this stitch marker right here. Normally, the beginning of the round is the start of the front of the sock or the end of the back of the sock, same spot. However, just for these sections, when it says knit 2 rounds, it means knit from this first stitch marker around once, and then from the stitch marker around a second time. So when you get to this stitch marker, you will stop to do the next part of the heel. Another tip that is helpful when you're doing the first stitch on either side, so right when you're reaching the front of the sock or when you've gotten from the front of the sock and you're going to the heel, knit that first stitch really tight. Try to pull that section as tight as you can. What can happen is you can end up with little gaps right here, which is fine. You can fix them at the end. That's what I usually do. But the tighter you pull them, the less likely it is that you'll have a gap. Okay, so now we have knit 2 rounds and we're back to the temporary beginning of the round, that first stitch marker. What we're doing now is essentially the opposite of what we did before. Before we started on the outside and worked our way inward. This time we're starting from the inside and working our way out to the end. And when we do it this time, we're going to be closing those stitches with a knit 2 together or purl 2 together as we reach them. So on that first row, you're going to knit until you reach the stitch marker. Because we're going to be going based off where those double stitches are, we are not going to need the stitch marker anymore. So we are just going to take this and get rid of it. We're going to knit one more stitch after removing the stitch marker, and then we're going to turn our work. Now we're going to do the same thing we did before with a German short row. So that first stitch is going to become a double stitch. Since we're on the wrong side, we're purling, and we are going to go until we get to that stitch marker. When we get to the stitch marker, we're going to do the same thing that we did before. We don't need the stitch marker anymore, so we're just going to go ahead and get rid of it. And then we're going to purl one extra stitch. Then we're going to turn our work. We are now on the right side. We're going to do another German short row and make that double stitch. And now that we're on the knit side, we're going to knit until we reach the next double stitch. So I'm just going to knit along here, and it should be pretty clear when you get to the double stitch. It'll look a little different from the other stitches. So I knit one, and here is my double stitch. And now if you're knitting them through the back loop, you can do that way. I'm knitting them through the front loop, so I'm going to keep doing that. Make sure I grab both legs. I'm going to knit that double stitch together, and then I'm going to knit one extra stitch afterwards. Then turn the work. Now we're going to do the same thing just on the purl side. German short row, make that double stitch. Since we're on the purl side, we are purling. So we're just going to purl across until we get to our double stitch. It's the same thing on the purl side and the knit side. The only difference is on one side you're knitting and on the other side you're purling, but you're doing essentially the same thing. So we're about to get to that double stitch here. When we're on the purl side, instead of knitting it together, we're going to purl two together. Again, I'm going to make sure that I grab both those legs when I'm purling it. Purl two together, purl one extra stitch, turn our work, and same thing. German short row, go until you get to the double stitch, knit two together, knit one extra, turn your work. German short row, purl to the double stitch, purl two together, purl one, turn your work. Back and forth like that. So essentially each time we're knitting a bit further until we get all the way out to the end. I'll show you what it looks like when we get to the end here. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. We're on the knit side. We're going to do the same thing where we knit two together and we knit one extra stitch, which is now the last stitch. We're going to do the same thing we did before. We're still going to turn our work. We're still going to do German short row here and make this a double stitch. And then we are going to purl to the end here. Now we are to the end of the purl side. We're going to do the same thing we did before, where we purl that double stitch together, and then we're going to purl that last stitch and turn our work. Now normally we would create another double stitch here. However, since we're at the end and we're going to be knitting around, on this very last row we're not going to make a double stitch when we are on the right side of the work. Instead, we're just going to slip that first stitch with the yarn in the back. So that stitch is slipped, yarn is in the back, and then we're going to knit across. And the final step of the heel is going to be knitting that last double stitch together. Okay, we've made it to the last stitch, and for that last double stitch on the knit side, we're going to do the same thing where we knit two together. Now we have completed our heel. We're going to have the same number of stitches that we started with. So the stitch count doesn't really change. You just end up with double stitches and then you close the double stitches. So however many stitches you started the heel with, you will now end the heel with. If for some reason you have the wrong number of stitches and something happened, you can throw a make one in there and knit two together or whatever it may be, so that you have the correct number of stitches. Now we have this heel shape, and it looks a little crazy when it's not attached to socks. But as you can see, we have this heel shape where you can see we did those German short rows along the sides here. Now you would have the rest of the sock in the front here, and you would start to knit in the round and knit the foot. That's it. Once you do the heel, there's nothing else you do, you just move on to the foot. And the same advice I gave before is relevant here. When you're doing the first stitch on either side, you want to knit that as tight as possible. So as you're starting the front of the sock, you want to knit that stitch super tight. Now that we've finished the heel, the beginning of the round is back here where the front of the sock starts and the back of the sock ends. So the beginning of the round only changes for that middle section. Now it's back in the normal spot. Now we just keep knitting and we have a normal looking sock. To demonstrate here, we started working the heel here, so we were working our way inwards, then we knit those rounds, then we worked our way out. That gives us this here, so our heel is turned, and once you finish that section, you're knitting along here. So you do the leg, you do the heel, and then you start the foot. There's no like gusset, decrease, or anything like that that you have on other socks. And then you'll just follow the rest of the pattern as instructed, and you've got your heel. So when you do finish your sock and you're all the way down, something that can happen with German short row heels is you can end up with a hole right here. You can remember I told you to knit those stitches really tight when we're doing that center portion and at the end of the heel. No matter how tight you knit them, there is a good chance that you might still end up with a small hole. What I like to do is when my sock is inside out and I'm weaving my ends in, I just take some extra yarn and I close the hole. You can just create an extra stitch there and pull it tight. You don't even have to do anything fancy. You can just kind of wrap the yarn around in there and pull it tight and close the hole. You won't even be able to notice once you are wearing them. So we've got the heel here, and you can't really tell that there's a hole here. I closed them up. I didn't do it in any kind of fancy way. I just pulled the yarn through wherever I felt like it to make the hole close. This heel method is different than other heel methods that I normally use, but it does create sort of that traditional sock-like look, and it's nice to be able to just do the heel and then do the foot of the sock. For a lot of designs, that's very useful. I hope this tutorial was helpful. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and happy knitting!